My why is because I believe every single person deserves to be heard. That every single person has greatness within them.
Hello, I'm Kate McKay, and welcome back to another episode of Master Your Life. Today, I'm honored to interview Emma Churchman. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you, Kate. I'm delighted to be with you.
I'm thrilled. And Emma, I'm going to talk a little bit about you, and just first by saying she's the new best-selling author of a book that's releasing soon called The Deep End of Hope in the Wake of Hurricane Helene, 40 Days and Nights of Survival and Transformation. And the reason why I am so thrilled to be interviewing you and sharing this time is because you were the first person I've ever followed on Facebook and said, oh my goodness, I must interview this woman. I must meet her. And I'm honored again that you're here with me to share your story of trauma and of transformation. So I'm just going to pass the baton to you. And if you don't mind just sharing with us a story of this book.
Sure, absolutely. So I live in Western North Carolina in a teeny tiny town called Girton, which has 301 people in it. And we were in an area that was hit incredibly hard by Hurricane Helene in September 2024. So imagine for a moment that you wake up and you don't have cell phone service. The cell towers and the internet service towers are out. There is no power. You only have a couple of days of food in your house. You're running out of water. You go to turn on the tap on your faucet in your kitchen. No water comes out. There are trees down all around your house. You try to leave and realize there's no way to get out. You can't get out by foot or by car because all of the roads are littered with downed trees and mudslides. And you can only reach a handful of neighbors around you. The only way out is to bushwhack through thick forest for 3 miles to get to the fire station. And no one has any communication with anyone. And we didn't know if anyone knew that we were alive. So we finally, the hurricane subsided, it stopped raining. We go outside and it's completely silent.
What did it sound like? I was very curious about that.
Yeah, it sounded like nothing. There were no birds chirping. There were no animals outside. There were no people outside. There was nothing.
That's intense. What was the leading up to the storm? Because as I mentioned to you earlier, I was in Florida, so we knew it was going to be coming up and coming up fast to where I was as well in the St. Tampa area. But what were you prepared for or not?
Yeah, well, we live in the mountains, right? We live 300 miles from the coast. And traditionally, I live outside of Asheville, and Asheville has a ring of mountains around it. And so what we learned moving here was that the mountains always protect you, right? Any hurricane that would come up against the mountains would just whimper and die historically. So we were not at all prepared.
Right. How would you describe leading up to it? And what was your experience when the storm was happening?
It's interesting because my husband, Jeff, is from New Orleans, and he lived through Hurricane Katrina and had flooding in his house and couldn't move back to it for a year. And there was looting and just horrendous things happening. And so he was very protective. When we started to hear the really heavy winds and the heavy rainfall, he put all the curtains down. He didn't want me to see what was happening. And I kept thinking, Jeff, we have to open the windows. We have to know what's going on. And he said, you do not want to see it. It's going to terrorize you. And I didn't realize until later how right he was when I was talking with a girlfriend of mine who lives a couple of miles from us. And she said that she had been hiding in her bathroom because it was the only room without windows. And she heard what sounded like an earthquake at the height of the hurricane. And she went out to her window and looked out and saw rocks the size of her car tumbling by and trees rushing by her house, giant, like 100-foot trees rushing by. And I thought, oh my God, what a terrifying experience.
It's hard to imagine the magnitude. And I think that's so much. And the reason why I was so passionate, and I think that's why God put me to you, is because I don't know why I came across you on my feed. And I began with just your daily stories. And if you don't mind sharing how this happened, because I couldn't wait for the next episode. And that's what it felt like. It was like, because I had a heart in Asheville. I felt like that's a second home for me. It was a place I dearly loved. I loved the diversity of the people, the kind of raw kind of vibe. It had great hiking restaurants. It had a raw feel to it that I loved. I was like, I'm home here. It felt like when I would go home back to Massachusetts, I would always stop in Asheville. It was my stop. I was like straight up to Florida into the mountains. I loved it. I saw my first bear up there when I was hiking. It was pretty exciting. But how did the writing happen?
Sure. Yeah. So my background is as a trauma chaplain, as a mentor to business owners and leaders and entrepreneurs, as a spiritual advisor. And a lot of what I do is, writing for my own business, helping my clients with their messaging and writing. I was raised by a journalist who was raised by a journalist. So writing has always been around me. And when the hurricane hit, I didn't have access to, I couldn't do anything other than sit down with a pad of paper and write my feelings out. I couldn't talk to anyone. I couldn't go on social media to see what was happening for other people. I had to find a way internally to process what was happening. So I started making these journal entries on what was happening each day as the wake of the hurricane unfolded. And then once I did have access to social media, I started putting those out as daily Facebook posts. And lots of people, Kate, including you, started following these stories. And for them, I think it was helpful as a reader, and you can certainly speak to this, to just have a sense of what was going on, boots on the ground, in kind of real time with the recovery, the rescue and recovery efforts following the hurricane. But for me, it was very much cathartic to be able to get this stuff out of me and not hold on to it.
I felt like I was there and I felt the suffering, but I literally felt as though I was looking at it through your lens. And it was a very loving, realistic lens. It was like, I felt like I was boots on the ground there. I felt very, very attached. And also it seemed at that point in time, well, the media came quick to Florida, and they sort of touched down on the Asheville area, but it seemed like the people pulled it together and highlighted the suffering. Do you feel that? Like, what happened? Because I had a bunch of people up in New England that were like, oh, FEMA's totally helping out, this and that. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's an incongruity here. What is going on?
Right. Yeah, we didn't see FEMA for 27 days. The first people we saw were Homeland Security. That was on day 4. And then we saw a lot of military more than anyone else. And then actually, Mennonite Disaster Service was one of the first groups in our area to come and help with the recovery. They were removing trees from houses. So the book, The Deep End of Hope, is a fundraiser. So part of the proceeds will go towards Mennonite Disaster Service because they plan to be in our area for several years, helping to rebuild private bridges and rebuild homes.
Wow, that's impressive. So just talk us through that. Take us through that experience, because your husband was very much involved. It was like you guys had very different roles in a way. And I'm just curious what was the evolution of that?
Sure, absolutely. So our next door neighbors, Eric and Kate. Eric is a first responder. He's a firefighter. So he was involved from day one because he's part of our Girton Fire Department. And then Kate, his wife, is a botanist, and she's also a sawyer. She's a chainsaw expert. So
I was like, what's a sawyer?
Right. Right.
Wow.
And so they immediately, on day 2, they both bushwhacked their way down to the fire station. They hadn't been able to get there before, just to help do recovery of people. Right? Is everyone alive? Can people get out of their houses? Does anyone need medical attention? And they came home that second night and we fed them. They came over to our house every night and we had dinner together because, we didn't have power. We had a generator that we would turn on for a couple hours in the evening. So we would eat together and kind of debrief the day. And Jeff and I looked at each other and thought, okay, Eric and Kate have figured out what their roles are. What are our roles going to be?
Wow.
Yeah. So for Jeff, his phone was the only phone on our mountain that started working, just like with basic texting after a couple of days. And then maybe on day 5, his Facebook was also working where he could post. No one else's phone was working. So he became command central. And we do have a Facebook group for our local community. And we had family members, people who were worried, coming onto that Facebook group saying, is my family member alive? Is my home still there? So he was helping to facilitate those communications and get some supplies to come in and help us. And then because of my background as a trauma chaplain, I walked down to the fire station on day 4 and talked to the fire chief and said, look, no one's here to help us. I'm a trauma chaplain. Do you need some help? And he said, yes, here's your first case.
Wow. 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 Talk about boots on the ground.
Yeah.
Incredible. Well, you highlight something that I found very, very interesting about the different roles that people play during something traumatic. And I think that this is something really very fascinating. And I would love it if you would share those different roles that people play.
Yes. Yes. So I created categories in my mind for these different people who I was interacting with because I was trying to make sense of what was happening. It was like the Wild West down there. So we live on the top of a mountain, right? It's a 3-mile hike down the mountain to the fire station, which became the central hub for everything happening in our community of 301 people in our fire district. And it became dangerous. I mean, everyone had weapons on them because when there's so much unknown, people don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. There's so much fear. And so they were all responding in whatever ways they could figure out how to respond. So I was kind of watching these dynamics play out. And I saw, I think, probably 6 different categories of people unfold over those first 40 days. So the first category was what I called evacuees. So they are people who took one look at what was happening and thought, I am getting the F out of here. I don't want to have anything to do with this, right? My home's either gone and I can't live in it, or has serious damage and I can't deal with it right now, or I don't want to be living in this kind of Wild West environment. I'm going to get myself out of here. So those were the evacuees who then came back a month or so later with an enormous amount of guilt.
This I found very fascinating because you wrote about it and how you had to deal with those people that they wanted to be comforted. Meanwhile, you're like, you had to learn the layers of how to comfort people.
Yeah, exactly.
Fascinating.
Exactly.
Yep. So
because they escaped that initial trauma and then a month later had it. And we had all kind of gone through our initial stages of trauma already, and we couldn't really relate to people coming back.
No.
So that was the first category. And then the second category is what I call preppers. So people who already lived off grid, already had solar power, already, hunted for their food, already had stores of food saved in their pantries ready to go, who really didn't have a lot of lifestyle change when it came to the hurricane because they just kept on doing what they were doing and seemed to be coping with things incredibly well. So they were the most prepared. The third category is what I call homesteaders. So these are people who would not leave their home, wouldn't leave it. Even if, their house was flooded, there was mold growing, there was a tree through their roof, would not leave because they were concerned about what would happen if they couldn't protect their only asset.
Wow.
Yeah, I understand that. Jeff and I didn't want to leave either. And we were saying to ourselves, we're going to have to leave when we run out of propane and we can't even turn our generator on for 2 or 3 hours at night. But we didn't want to because it was dangerous. There were people once people figured out how to get up our mountain, there were random people showing up all day long in our homes and we didn't know who they were or what they wanted. And it was terrorizing. There were people who showed up with guns at other people's houses in the middle of the night, trying to take what they wanted to take. So for good reason, these homesteaders didn't want to leave, but a lot of them were not able to function on their own and required a lot of support from our fire department and from volunteers just to be able to function day to day.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so we have the evacuees, preppers, homesteaders.
Yes. The volunteers would be another category. So And I don't know how your audience is going to respond to this, but
It's all good.
Okay, there are different categories of
Yes.
volunteers. Like there are people who came in with their own ATVs or side by sides, their own equipment, their own chainsaws, their own saw oil, their own food and water, and genuinely said, here's my skill set. How can I be of service? I'm going to go be self-sufficient. I don't need you to handhold me. I'll figure it out. And they were phenomenal. And then there were the volunteers who would show up and be super upset that we weren't already completely organized and ready for them, who had to stand around for hours waiting to be of service, and then would get upset if they weren't given a task that they deemed to be appropriate. So that what they wanted was to be able to go into someone's home and save them from the hurricane, not organize supplies. So
Right.
those were volunteers that were more challenging to deal with. So one of the teachings in my book is when you do want to go somewhere that you're not from and be of service, that's wonderful, but make sure that you know what you're getting into and that you're bringing resources instead of becoming a drain on resources.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. Very true.
Yep.
Yep.
And then another category is helpers. So
Mm.
these are, and Jeff and I were in this category, Eric and Kate were as well, people either who lived here or who came in as maybe they had second homes here, but came here with the full intention of just wanting to help.
Mhm.
And sometimes that was beautiful, right? Because, for example, I could give my services as a trauma chaplain. There were other people who had unique skill sets that they were able to bring to the table. And then there were some people who overworked themselves and maybe, were overcompensating, where there were a handful of folks who were either volunteers or from here who, would work so much that they became hard to be around.
Yeah, they were like had the savior status, but were human, right?
Yes.
And that's a lot to handle. I bet that was something for you too, right? And
Yeah.
so in the midst of all this, you had dealt with a close family trauma yourself in the midst of
Yes.
this community trauma.
Yeah, I had. So there is a history of suicide in my family. So my father died when I was 24 years old. I'm 50 now. One of my youngest brother died in 2021. He died by suicide. Less than 2 months before Hurricane Helene, my middle brother died by suicide. And then 2 weeks after the hurricane, the brother closest in age to me died by suicide.
I'm so sorry, Emma.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Wow. I just, it's so interesting thinking about you being such a source of peace and calm and the vision of light for me. And I didn't even know who you were just with your words, and to allow me to experience what I experienced through you. I'm forever grateful. And I don't even know you, Emma. Right. And so I just want to say that how important it is that what you do, I can't express to you enough how important it is who you are as a person, as the light of who you are. I simply can't express it. So aside from saying thank you, but where is that source in you, Emma? What is that? Do you have a perspective on your uniqueness that's different maybe over the last few months?
That resilience.
Even more. It's like fortitude. It's
Yeah.
even know. I'm writing a new book called The Agility Factor. We hear a lot about resilience, but there is something called psychological fortitude, which is a foundational base of light and strength that not all people have. Like we can all bounce back, clowns that we used to punch when we were kids, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're in general, people are resilient, but not everyone has fortitude and the grit to persevere and be the light in the darkness. And you do. And it's very unique.
Yeah. Yeah. So my first answer is I have no idea.
You always like that though? I'm just curious about what was the evolution, because
Yeah.
you grew up as a Quaker. I went to Quaker camp when I was a kid in Maine,
Oh.
and we just meditated to the sunset. It was so awesome. But I just
Yeah.
remember the quiet of it, right? So when you were describing, so quiet's very, very important to me. But after the hurricane, obviously that was a different kind of quiet. But what was your spiritual evolution?
Yeah. A lot of it was a decision. I made a decision about a year after our father died. So I was 25 years old and I thought, thought, I cannot live in reaction to the trauma that I was raised in anymore. I can't be that person who's just living in reaction. There has to be a different way.
Wow.
It put me into a time of deep prayer and deep worship, asking God, essentially, where the F are you?
Yeah, exactly. Hello.
Yeah. What the heck is going on? Yes. Yeah. And that eventually, 5 years later, 10 years later, had me in seminary, and then had me teaching spiritual leadership development to college age students, serving as a spiritual director, and then training and working as a trauma chaplain. So it was the decision that I can't be someone who's just living in reaction. I have to be someone who is creating, or with God, co-creating my reality. When the hurricane hit, it was that same kind of decision. Do I want to be the person who is paralyzed by this or not? Or do I want to be a person who is resourced within myself and a resource to others?
Considering what the trauma that had gone through your family lineage. And when I heard you say that with your father, is like, I'm not going to live in reaction. It's a dead no to that. Like, I cannot, and I will not. And sometimes our healing begins there, doesn't it?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And, if you look at my 3 younger brothers, they all chose to keep living in reaction. They all became drug or alcohol addicts, or both, because they couldn't figure out how to not live in reaction.
So they just never got over the loss of their dad.
Yeah. Or our mother has a mental illness. Or being raised by mental illness.
Right. Yep. In that. But it's just pretty extraordinary that the journey through, and then where you were placed. It's so wild. It's so incredibly wild.
Yep.
So what do you see from your perspective now, where you sit and where you write, and what you feel you're called to do, Emma?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I've got a second book coming out in 2025 as well. It'll be released in September, and it is also a story of trauma and recovery. It's a memoir about my childhood, being raised by a mother with a mental illness and an alcoholic, abusive father, and our journey, my brothers and I, and what happened. So writing these 2 books simultaneously.
Wow, you're so brave.
Yeah, and kind of immersing myself in what does it mean to be in trauma and what does it mean to be in recovery. That is really my focus moving forward. So my teaching around this is that we have to learn how to process trauma as we are going through it. We no longer have the luxury of hanging out on a therapist's couch for a decade feeling our feelings.
I agree beyond. This is what I talk about all the time. We have to do the self-work and the social work at the same time. There's no more the luxury that I can just egoically talk about how I feel. There's no time.
Right. There's not. Yeah. And, after Hurricane Helene, just while I was in the process of writing this book, there were 3 other major natural disasters that happened in Florida. And then there were fires in Wyoming. And then there was a huge flood in Valencia, Spain, that killed something like 236 people in 8 hours. Just horrendous. We can't avoid this. This isn't something that we're going to sit back and read about and say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to that other person. No, it could happen to you. And I'm not a worst case scenario person. And I'm telling you, it could happen to you too.
Right. And here you are on the top of a mountain.
Right.
And it's like a hurricane reorganizes the entire geography around you.
Yes.
I mean, it's freaky. People don't, and in some ways I have so much trauma. I haven't gone up there yet, but I've moved, as I said, to Atlanta. So I'm closer, and my kids keep going, Mom, when you go to Asheville? I'm like, I am. I got to talk to Emma first, because I want to make sure I'm the good helper, not the pain in the ass.
Yeah.
And part of my work is, I think that's the reason why I found you, because you're going to be the source of being able to have me be the voice, to have more people spotlighted on the work you do, you as a person, as a spiritual warrior, because I do believe that there's another phase, because you talk about the trauma and the recovery, but after that is what? That's what I think that we're talking about, you and I together.
The evolution.
Yes. And it's the evolution, and it's something that now you lived through, and it no longer defines you necessarily. It's a part of your story.
Right.
But what is your methodology, or how do you language that journey? And is it mostly asking questions as a spiritual director, or are you more of a guider? Because I know spiritual direction just because I was trained in that as well, but how do you look at your work?
Yeah, fabulous. And, I'm actually putting together a series of courses and a certification program on trauma recovery. So you're
Perfect.
asking that at exactly the right time as I'm in the midst of that. So I see it as happening in 4 phases. There's the rescue phase, recovery, reconstruction, and evolution.
Nice.
And the rescue is, really getting the basics handled. Are you safe? Are you sleeping through the night? Do you have access to food and shelter? Are you able to eat? Do you have some kind of an income or a way to provide for yourself? That's the rescue phase.
Excellent.
And then the recovery phase is more of an assessment, like, okay, how do I feel in my body? Oh, I have bruises all over my body. Hadn't noticed that for several weeks. Let me get in touch with being in a relationship with my body again, and my emotions and my brain and my spirituality.
Like my grief counselor described it this way. She's like, when something traumatic happens, it's like a grief bomb. And like you look around and the landscape is very different. Things that used to be exposed are no longer there. And then things that were once covered are now there. So your literal landscape, it has shifted.
Yeah, exactly.
And you know it more than most people, right?
Yeah.
And
then that moves you into phase 3, the reconstruction, which is, okay, I'm no longer the person I was, or my reality is no longer what it was. How is it going to be reconstructed? What could that look like? And then the evolution, the phase 4 is, where do I go from here? Now that I am this new version of myself, now that I am in this new environment, where do I go from here? What I believe that everything happens for us, not to us. So from that perspective, what's possible now?
And where do I go from there? And who am I here to serve from this new place of awareness? Which, and it's interesting because I have this very similar kind of patterning where it's like there are people in the re-evolutionary cycle that they're just living in that hamster wheel. And there are people that are in the de-evolution, they're dying, whether it's addiction, mental illness. There are people that are actually like dying, even though they're sort of living. And the people that are really going to be the helpers, the real true helpers, the warriors, are the people that have busted out and are on the evolutionary path. And that's really, 8 to 10% of people at most. It's a work. And yet we can exponentially make changes. Exponentially, I believe, have the biggest impact. And that's what excites me.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. And if you think about the book of Revelation, like the generic teaching on the book of Revelation is those people who are ascending and evolving will leave when the apocalypse comes. But I think it's the opposite. We're the ones who stay. Everyone else checks out.
I agree. Right. And that's the rebirth. Revelation's the rebirth. It's like everything gets uncovered. The light gets uncovered. I say yes to that. Well, I am like super pumped about supporting you on this process as well, because who knew that so much of our processes are so paralleled? We're going to have some amazing fun. I'm really looking forward to that. So from the book, what are your hopes and what are the ways that people can support you and your mission? This is very important for me as a heartfelt mission. And I'm looking forward to supporting you.
Absolutely. So buy the book. It's available on all platforms, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, Indigo Books, all online retailers. Just do a Google, The Deep End of Hope by Emma Churchman. Again, a portion of the proceeds of the book go to Mennonite Disaster Service because they will be here doing long-term recovery. One of my main hopes from this book, well, 2 of them. One is that people will really understand what it's like boots on the ground to live through a natural disaster. Because like we alluded to earlier, the media news cycle on this was very short, considering that we are still in the initial stages of recovery and we're 4 or 5 months in now.
Let's just put it, let me reword that. It's absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
I was horrified by the media and what I was actually reading and knowing to be true from you and from various other people that were giving a very clear and heartfelt vision and view. And I think it was horrific, actually.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. We still have armed guards at the entrance to our community because most of our roads are barely passable. It's still too dangerous to be here. So yeah, it still continues. And then my other hope from the book is for people to really understand the importance of supporting long-term recovery efforts. It's going to take at least a decade, if not longer, to get any semblance of a functional world here in Western North Carolina.
Absolutely. So we're talking about this as the work that you're meant to do here. And what I would like to know from you is, from this beautiful healing cycle, what do you want people to know, Emma?
Well, I would like them to know that it's totally possible to process trauma as you're going through it. And that every person can make that choice and that decision to do that. My book has a lot of education, a lot of resources about how to do that. There are courses that accompany the book that will teach you how to process the trauma yourself as you're going through it, how to help others process their trauma. So my hope, my intention is that more people understand that they don't have to live in a traumatized way.
No, they don't. And wow, I mean, imagine the impact if that becomes more of a known truth, you know? And so what prevents that from happening, Emma? Why is it that we live in a society, do you think, that is so attached to trauma?
Oh, this is going to be a little politicizing.
Please, go ahead.
I think that the generation that's being raised now is being raised in a way that coddles all of us to feel or think that we're special, and that our unique sensitive needs need to be upheld and lifted above all else. And there's less of a requirement that we learn to be autonomous and self-sufficient within ourselves, within our emotions, our mental capacity, our spiritual capacity.
Right.
And I think it's a real shame that we're not being taught to be more resilient.
And I think that, and I've been saying this, that what I loved about what happened out of Asheville is all the people, all the men in particular, because I feel like so much of, and I don't know, only because I work a lot with men as a high performance coach, is that men need to provide and protect. They need that action to be able to be men and to rip shit up and to saw and to cut and to rescue. They need purpose in a society that's emasculated them. Did you notice that? Was that something that you saw with a lot of men rising?
100%, especially with my husband. I mean, he became a version of himself that I hadn't seen before. And it was so necessary. He helped so many people.
Unbelievable.
But he was very kind of purpose and mission driven. And then after the first 60 days, when things started to calm down and much more help was coming in, he felt like he had lost his purpose to some extent.
So it's like the man home from war.
Yeah, totally.
Wow, that's incredible. So your marriage shifted in a way. Wow, it's pretty amazing. Really pretty wild. Oh my goodness. So I'm going to share all of this, the contacts and ways that they can support you. If you could just let the audience know ways that they can reach out to you and also support your mission. Obviously, we'll have the book, and please buy the book, people. You will not be disappointed. Her writing is so heartfelt and so beautiful and articulate. I was deeply touched, and I don't very rarely go off like this, but I do. If you don't mind sharing where people can find you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So my website is emmachurchman.com. You can learn about the books, about my trauma courses, about my background there. It's very easy to find me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Just do a search for Emma Churchman. You'll see me come up as spiritual advisor, mentor, and coach.
Yes, right on. And I just want to say thank you again. I look forward to meeting you live and serving arm in arm with you in your community and the community at large to bring the light and inspiration to others. So thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to all you viewers and listeners. I'm Kate McKay, and this is Master Your Life. And remember, be the helper. You have so many gifts that you can share, and the world awaits your unique gifts. Thank you, and I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.